Reinventing normal with Landini.
Hi, I think this episode should probably be retitled Reinventing Everything, because today I'm speaking with one of the most insanely inquisitive and restless minds I've ever known. I met Tom Dixon when we were both starting out. We collaborated on multiple projects, we shared a workshop by the Oval, we restyled a Charlotte Perriand project and became very good friends. Personally, I found Tom's journey as interesting as the results it's achieved, and I'm sure you will do too.
Hey, Tom. There you are.
Look at you.
Look at me.
Reclining back in your gentrified gear. How are you?
It's cold, man. Yeah. I'm okay. Everything's fine, I guess.
So, well, you've got to be off in an hour, so I'm just going to ask you a bunch of questions, and you're going to answer them, I think. But essentially, the whole thing's it's just called Reinventing Normal, and it's basically just a question about whether or not the accepted way of doing things is the right way of doing things, or whether or not there's another way of doing it. And that's kind of been the premise of much of our work and something that interests us. So given your history, we thought it would be appropriate to get your kind of take on that.
Okay.
That's sense?
Good. Who do you broadcast to then?
Global.
BBC, of course.
Yeah, we've been pretty inconsistent with our episodes, but we're just reinventing the normal of the release schedule flow, you know. I'm gonna mute myself, guys, and let you get on with it. So
all right, okay. You're all right, Tom, you're good to go. All right, okay. So as I was saying, in these discussions, Tom, we're trying to understand if the accepted way of doing things is the only way, or whether there's another way which has yet to be invented, and that's what we call reinventing normal. And I guess one of the reasons we were keen to talk to you was because your journey has been somewhat unique to where you are today as one of, I guess, I hesitate to say one of the most iconically recognizable designers in the world. You, for example, as I recall, turned a personal injury where you were a musician into basically the beginnings of your career. You started welding when you broke your wrist before going on tour. You discarded a formal education, which you didn't really embrace until you went to Habitat. Yet you have a kind of insanely encyclopedic knowledge of art and design, and you seem to be constantly looking for alternate ways of doing things, whether that's using different materials, finding inspiration in where is it, the Science Museum. I remember talking about that quite a lot, or using manufacturers in third world countries when no one else was doing that. So I kind of found this journey of yours, having known you now since you started, really, as interesting as the work that you produce. And so I kind of wanted to get you, if you could, to share as much of that journey with people who might be interested in listening, starting with your background and your upbringing, something that we've never really discussed. And I kind of wanted to understand whether you felt that informed the way that you think and the way that you reinvent the normal way of doing things. Was that unique in any way?
That is the longest question in the history of podcasts. Well, okay. Yes, of course.
You have a happy childhood, Tom? That's what I want to know.
I was going to say, the answer is yes. But you're talking about my background. I mean, just a quick summary. I am 1/4 Latvian, 1/4 French, and half English. And I hold 2 passports, an English one and a French one. I was born in North Africa, so Tunisia, and I lived in Egypt and Morocco before I came to the UK, aged 4. So I think the culture shock of all of that definitely informs, your constitution, and certainly speaking 2 languages, I think gives you a split personality. I'm also a cusp of Gemini and Taurus, and although I don't believe in horoscope,
you often revised my Italian, so I thought you could speak 3 languages.
No, I don't. I mean, fluency in a language, I think, allows you to have, 2 senses of humor, two worldviews. The French and the English have always been kind of in opposition anyway, and like I say, the split personality that you get there, I think, allows you to look at things from 2 perspectives. And I think, being born in somewhere really hot and then coming to somewhere really cold when I was tiny must have affected me in some way. We traveled a lot, which always, I think, often breeds creatives or people that want to look at things in a different way. So yeah, I think my background is instrumental in what I've become, but then so's everybody's, right?
Yeah, I guess. But well, that's interesting, because I don't think we've ever discussed that before. So I knew about the North African thing, or the African thing. But I think I kind of met you shortly after the motorbike accident. I kind of feel grateful that we've never had another one whilst I was with you, because I remember riding through Hyde Park, holding on to the back of a 3-foot wide walk once as you went back to your studio, and that taking off and hitting me in my back on regular occasions. But you were a musician, and you were on top of the pops, as you constantly remind me, and I wasn't. And you kind of had that accident and then turned into a kind of pop-up artist sort of overnight. How did that come about? What was that all about? What inspired that?
There was no inspiration.
The desire to perform?
No, I think just like everybody of our generation was in a band. I don't think it was an unusual hobby. And it was never a burning ambition of mine to be in the music business. I just happened to be in a band that took off for a very short period of time, and that was amazing. An amazing way to make a living. Again, lots of travel, lots of exposure to all kinds of things. I'm not a natural performer, but it toughened me up. I was very shy, I think, before being in a band, and that's certainly made you more outward looking. And I think it taught me a little bit about the entertainment industry, which I think has served me well in trying to understand the evolution of businesses like design that also, have an element of communication. And an element of performance in presenting stuff to clients or convincing people to buy your goods or whatever. But the most important thing about the music business in retrospect for me was kind of this notion that you could turn your ideas into a way of making a living. And I think, without going into too much detail, what was interesting about music in the UK at that period was the majority of people had taught themselves their own instruments and made up their own tunes and made their own posters and created their own gigs and got on the road, maybe even pressed their own records and done record sleeves. And it was a mini industry of sorts where you kind of you made your own story, and you went out and you projected that in a variety of ways. And then eventually we were signed up to a record label, which, again, is analogous to what's happened to me more recently, being bought by private equity. So it teaches you, like I say, autonomy, but more importantly, it teaches you that your own ideas and your own creativity are things that you can make a living from. I was a professional musician for 2 years, and I didn't really consider myself, as a as I didn't write the songs, I was a bass player, so I was, on the back line. But, being live on stage and being, having bottles thrown at you if the audience didn't like what you were doing, and having to stand up in front of a new crowd every night. I mean, it certainly toughened you up.
I think you've answered very well. I mean, I think I was kind of interested to understand how you went from being a musician to being sort of another kind of performer, because I think your work, at least at the time when it started, was very performance related. I mean, I know Cindy Palmano, for example, used a lot of it when she was taking photographs of Spandau Ballet. Cindy's someone we both knew without knowing that we both knew her, as I think we later found out. And that whole kind of creative salvage thing, which you could claim was visionary because it was actually all about sustainability, right? How that came about? I mean, what actually made you, what actually inspired you to go from being a musician to finding bits of scrap metal around the streets of London, welding them together, and creating a whole life out of that? What was the thing that started that? How did that come about?
Well, we'd already evolved. The band's pretty much lasted 2 or 3 years. I only lasted 2 years because I had to exit thanks to a motorcycle accident that you kind of referred to. So I broke my arm or my wrist on the a day before we were supposed to go on tour. So I was replaced by a much better bass guitarist. But by that time, we'd already started a series of clubs, like nightclubs. And so I had the means of making a living. And this specific nightclub had a stage, so it wasn't just a dance hall, it was a theatre. And we set about kind of creating a variety of performances on stage. It might be kung fu one night, or bodybuilding, or rap, or poetry, or whatever it was went on stage. And I'd learned how to weld, during that period, partly because I had a lot of spare time in the day. Nightclubs being a nocturnal activity, and the fact that you could actually make reasonable money just on a Friday and Saturday night. And really have vast amounts of spare time during the day and during the week. So I'd learned to weld. I had this collection of vintage motorcycles and cars at the time, and I thought that was really the reason that I went to learn welding, was because I thought I might be able to use it, for transport kind of thing. And so I learned in a friend's restoration garage in Streatham. And immediately was kind of taken by the speed at which you could create things. I'd fiddled at secondary school with ceramics. I'd been a technician in an art school for 6 months as well, where I'd learned woodwork. But metalwork, and specifically welding, was such a quick way of assembling things. And just to practice the welding, I'd gone with some friends to scrapyard and picked up, a series of pieces of metal, which, and we decided that we'd do an art show. And it was really the found objects combined with the speed of execution of welding that made me into designer. It just meant that, there was these ready-made shapes that would very quickly suggest functions of some sort. And so very rapidly it turned from being kind of abstract found object sculpture to being semi-functional furniture. Things made me think of table legs or lamp stands, and that's what it became. So it was very organic in terms of its evolution. But I've been interested, talked about sustainability. I've been interested in that at school. When I was 14, I did a project on a kind of earth house, a hippie earth house. And, sustainability as a subject, fascination isn't a new thing at all, right? It's something, very much in the 60s and 70s, people had already spotted, the degradation of the natural world, the need to be organic. The hippie movement had a lot of going back to the earth kind of feelings. So I'd been very interested in that as kind of school project thing. And then, you know, that time in London, the early 80s, was really a kind of a yuppie era with you know, people making inordinate amounts of money, and then a lot of people not making any money at all. The cityscape was full of people chucking out lots of old bits of material. You know, the end of industry in London as well. You know, where London had been, you know, also a workshop for the world. Yeah. You know, still jewelry factories, or even car factories until relatively recently, and all of that was being thrown into the skip, which provided me with a lot of raw material, basically. So then becoming a designer was really just practice, and you know, I think that's underestimated in terms of you know, in terms of the discipline of design. You know, if you're a ballet dancer or a classical musician, you practice 4 or 5 hours a day, you know, non-stop. And I think, you know, the way they teach design is sort of project by project, where you have to finish a project. Here, I had free materials. I had a very quick way of making things. And I set about doing that. So I was very prolific. I made a lot of very bad furniture, bad art, bad objects. But what I did was to learn very quickly structure and, you know, construction and you know, proportion, and then eventually very late on comfort, and you know, things that are more important in furnishings, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of, as I recall, I mean, you had all this scrap metal which you were welding together, and that, you know, has been called creative salvage and stuff, and that was kind of really unique. That got you a huge amount of PR. It seemed that you ran out of that kind of material along the way, and you chose to use other sources of sort of found materials, like I mentioned earlier, you know, woks and frying pans and bicycle forks and stuff like that. I mean, one of your most famous chairs, which I think it's actually behind me, I've still got one, the bull chair, the Taurus chair, whatever you call it. It's made out of a frying pan, wok handles, labels. What? Yeah.
You've got one?
Yeah. I think my check bounced about 3 times for it. You reminded me, but yeah, I've still got one. I wanted to buy 6, but Ricky wouldn't let me because she thought they were too dangerous and might kill our children. I saw one actually on the South Bank in Paris not so long ago for some insane amount of money in a shop.
Oh, how much? You made a wise investment then?
It was 66,000 euros. They were asking.
No.
Yeah.
How much did you buy it for?
150 quid.
That's your best investment ever, right?
Probably. Probably one of them, yeah. So how come you're not still doing that? I mean, the margins in that, I mean, your name, I mean, you talked about musicians and fame and stuff like that. I mean, you seem to, I think in your early days, understand that was important quicker than perhaps anyone else.
There was a bang in the background. What did I understand was important?
Well, I think from looking back in time, I mean, it seemed to me that you understood the media was a really, really powerful tool to promote you, to promote design, perhaps more so than many other emerging designers did ever. I mean, you were all over the media. Your work was being used, as I said before, for promotion of other people. It was kind of really iconic really early on. But then you kind of changed. You could no longer find scrap material, and you started using, as I say, found material like frying pans and ladle handles and stuff like that. And that seemed to me to be a progression into still very kind of sculptural work. And I know I asked you this question once before, but do you see yourself as a furniture designer, or do you see yourself as a sculptor, or do you not see any difference between the two?
Complete difference between the two. I mean, I probably work like a sculptor, but the discipline of design, you know, to actually frame a project is you know, I feel much more comfortable within that rather than, say, conceptual art, or you know, or any blank sheet of paper where you have to come up with the departure point of the project yourself, right? So, you know, the excuse of functionality and the formal characteristics of, say, designing a chair, you know, give me a very clear departure point from which you can endlessly riff off, you know. So I just always felt more comfortable with the constraints that design bring, or the challenge, you know, of trying to do something, you know, that is different, or something which is more economical, or something which is more comfortable, or something which is more sculptural. But the way I work is much more like, you know, I'm much more comfortable, you know, working freestyle, you know, and full-size modeling, you know, whether it's in cardboard or metal, from the get-go, and it's a relatively unconventional way of designing. And I'm not particularly good at designing to briefs, to be frank. You know, I'm much better off, you know, having an idea and seeing whether I can execute it first, you know, aesthetically, and then also commercially, you know, to see whether I can then sell it to the world. And, you know, I have to say that the idea that people were, you know, like yourself, prepared to hand over cash or bouncing checks in your case, for bits of scrap metal, is really what inspired me or made me believe that it was possible to make this into a job, you know, and that was a revelation, you know, because I'd never have had the confidence in my own ideas if people weren't prepared to transact.
Yeah, well, like I say, I mean, it became really popular really quickly. But then there was a kind of turning point, which I don't think anyone anticipated, perhaps not even yourself, when you took on the role of the Terence Conran's job at Conran to reinvent. I mean, our paths merged again there, because I was creative director of Terence Conran's design group, and you were offered the creative directorship of his probably most famous and iconic business, Habitat. And without any formal training, you became the global leader of, and, you know, created a new direction for that brand and business. I mean, that was really quite a reinvention of Tom Dixon. How did that come about? What did you learn from that? And did that lead to where you are today as a much more kind of mass-produced?
Well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't quite as simple as me being offered, you know, Terence's position. I mean, Terence's position was owner of the business, right? So, you know, that's the fundamental difference in authority, and you know, and I think Habitat had lapsed from being a design-led business and design-owned business, actually, because, you know, it was Terence's main motivation was design, you know, and he was an extremely good businessman. But, you know, the company had been acquired by IKEA, and what was interesting for me was leaping from, you know, what had been a small, you know, maybe 15 people doing metal work in a facility in Vauxhall, you know, that we shared, right, to working for one of the biggest, in fact, the biggest furniture company in the world. And the reason it happened was, you know, desperation, basically. I mean, I'd learned how to be a designer. I'd learned how to do manufacturing. I'd opened retail shop, and, you know, I was doing work also for the Italian luxury brands. I was doing jobbing metal work for people just to keep the whole thing going, and everything felt a bit shaky, to be honest. You know, I wasn't, you know, hadn't studied business or marketing or design or any of the disciplines that I was, you know, kind of recklessly engaging in. And so, you know, the whole, you know, the whole infrastructure was, you know, felt quite wobbly. And I think one client, you know, one big client that I was doing some architectural metal work didn't pay, and so I needed a job, you know, and I was a more junior job had come up in Habitat, but it was all timing. I mean, because I speak French, they wanted to move the design team to France, and they were looking for a French speaker. They wanted somebody that had a certain profile in design, and that had come through the working with the luxury Italian brands, so international presence, and also knew about craft, because a lot of the objects and manufacturing, a lot of the stuff involved in being creative director at Habitat was knowing all the provenances of everything and visiting the factories and modifying things, and so it was fortuitous that and I took over being head of design in the UK first, and then grew into being creative director internationally over 2 or 3 years there, and it was quite a lot of people felt that I was losing my my radical roots and going corporate, but it was more radical going and doing that, I think, than plugging away at doing studio-based metalwork in Vauxhall. And I learned a huge amount through that experience.
I think that's kind of close to what we talk about a lot, in this podcast, is reinventing normal. Is that for Habitat to engage someone with literally no design training, with a quite a radical reputation when Habitat was in fact a mainstream duplex furnishing brand, was really quite brave on that.
I don't think they knew what they were doing. I mean, seriously.
What?
I don't think they knew what they were doing, to be honest.
Right.
I think it took a lot of debating. I mean, I hung about waiting for a response to my. In fact, the first, even for my first interview, I walked in and with a motorcycle helmet, and they thought I was a courier, a motorcycle courier. So I waited in reception for literally an hour and a half, with them thinking that I was late turning up, and the receptionist thinking I was just waiting for a parcel. So I mean that kind of my introduction to the empire. And literally, I was in charge of a very small British design team. The business was managed from France, and I was able to discreetly do a couple of projects in the UK, which had a reasonable impact. The first one being a project which I called Living Legends, which was really trying to find the oldest designers I could, and celebrate their careers, which were in parallel to Habitat's emergence, right? And so I had a great time working with some of the living legends of the 20th century before they all started dying, on me, and I had to modify the name of the project, but I was able to work under the radar, is what I'm saying, because I was only head of design of one part of the organisation, and able to prove myself doing that actually quite quickly.
Yeah, and I remember that happening. It was, what was the design of the chairs? It's not Robin Day. He was the TV presenter.
Yes.
Robin Day.
No, there were 2 Robin Days. Yeah.
Okay. And I remember you reintroducing that chair in different colours, which I don't think anyone expected. I think everyone expected Habitat to start producing sort of welded candlesticks and the kind of things that you've been doing prior. But then you introduced these brands that were invented at the same time as Habitat invented in the 60s, and really, in really fresh, vibrant colours, and made them relevant again. That reinvented those designers' careers as it did yours as well. How difficult was that to sell as an idea?
Well, it was a pragmatic solution to the amount of time it would take to create properly new designs. I mean, and also trying to remind people of the origins of Habitat in the 60s, which was such a radical time in terms of furniture design, for sure, and all kinds of design. So it takes maybe 2 years for things to come out if you're designing from zero. The advantage here is I could go into archives and do 2 or 3 jobs in one go. One which is avoid tooling charges, which often in things like Robin Day's chair would have been substantial sums of money. It gave me allowed me to make a statement about Habitat being one of the original voices in retail and in home style, and speed up the process, and then it gave me an amazing history lesson in being able to approach people like Castiglione, who must have been 90 at the time, Werner Panton, who was around 85, Pierre Poulain, the French genius who must have been 78, Anna Castelli, and I could go on, and maybe 10 or 15 of the geniuses of 60s design that kind of surrounded Terence Conran when he started the firm in the 60s. So it was part marketing project, part pragmatic refreshing of the range, and definitely anchoring Habitat in its original things rather than talking about myself. I mean, I quite like the idea of being able to talk in the voice of a historic label. We did that at Habitat. We did that also at a Finnish company called Artec later on.
Yeah. I know them well. So what did you learn at Habitat? Because you were only there, for 3 years, was it? 3, 4, 5 years?
10 years.
No, really? Gosh.
Yeah.
And then you started Tom Dixon. How did that come about? And what did you take from Habitat, or what did you learn at Habitat that allowed you to kind of keep that kind of fresh, unexpected approach that continues in your work today?
Well, I was getting a bit comfortable in my corporate job after 8 or 9 years. And I mean, your question about how I came to have Terence Conran's job, and my response was I didn't have Terence Conran's job because I wasn't the owner. Was bugging me out. The Habitat had gone through 3 or 4 CEOs that all had come from mainly from IKEA at the time. I didn't get the feeling that they really understood the label, and certainly the company wasn't design led anymore. It was commerce led with designers, marketing, and merchandising arrangement, not design led in the way that it had been in the origins. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to change that, and I wouldn't be able to have a company that really did believe in design unless I created my own company. So I jumped from the frying pan into the fire basically, and I could have been cruising along quite comfortably in a corporate job for much longer, but I was getting frustrated. I wasn't able to to carry out what I knew was right for the company. And so it was time to also design again, because creative direction, as is very different from designing. You're working in a very different way. So I had lots of pent up energy, lots of ideas. I'd learned the whole world of sourcing, partly through the IKEA organization, partly through Habitat agents. And so I knew where things were made in Vietnam, in Poland, in France, in Thailand, and I also knew what people really bought in homewares, and I'd had a lot of exposure to many different categories that would never really have been of interest to me, like plush toys, or art prints, or things that you wouldn't normally have a point of view on as a product designer. So I was hungry to try and express my own voice again, and then somebody came into, a business guy came into my office one day, wanted to find out about the furniture business and wanted to interview me about that, and we decided to make a plan to pull me out of Habitat and create my own label.
So reinventing yourself once again. I remember in those early days you were using a lot of plastic molding, kind of really quite crude sort of molding. The Jacks, I think, came out of
no, that was actually before Habitat. So that's my first attempts at industrial production, moving away from welding and thinking about mass production. And so that was kind of, again, funded by a separate business partner, and was definitely my first exposure to doing things in a kind of more international way, and certainly in a more industrial way as well.
Well, I mean,
Uh,
okay, I forgot. My sense of time is completely out. But it seems to me that the mass production aspect of it was something that you started getting into. I mean, prior to all the habitat thing, as you say, you were making objects, often for commission, from objects that you found. But the habitat thing was about mass production, as it seems.
well, yes, but even predating habitat, you know, the place where I really learned about, you know, designers catalyst to industry was Italy. You know, where you know, by working with people like Cappellini and Moroso, I was exposed to much more kind of fertile ground for design. You know, Italian industry really does understand the value that design can bring to, you know, to product lines in terms of making it more internationally appealing. You know, also using designers as communicators as well. I mean, the Italians were masters of that. You know, the manufacturing brands always use designers to communicate new ideas or do radical things for publicity, but also design, like I say, as a catalyst to industrial production. And so I'd learned a hell of a lot from the Italians already, beyond doing things out of scrap metal. I've become frustrated with the limitations of scrap in terms of making multiples, because, you know, you could only make as much as you could find. And I've become more and more interested in industrial production techniques beyond just welding, you know. So I've done quite a lot before Habitat, and again, that was a reason why I had, you know, a broad enough design life before Habitat to be interesting to Habitat. And then with Habitat, what I really learned was much more about retail, which is your forte, and understanding a lot more what people really buy and how they buy it, and what they're interested in terms of stories. Working also much more like, I guess, like a fashion company with, you know, three collections a year: spring, summer, autumn, winter, and Christmas. You know, so the rate at which you had to produce things in Habitat was very, very different from, you know, having your own design company or working for the Italians, you know, the Italian serious furniture. It was much more retail orientated. So I learned about communication there, because we were doing, you know, catalogs. You know, that's where, you know, the press became really interested in the idea of somebody slightly less conventional, working in a corporate environment, because that was also the story going on in fashion at the time with John Galliano, and, you know, Vivienne Westwood, and all the British radicals going into the French fashion houses was quite a big story at the time. So mine was kind of a similar path, if you like, but in a different sector.
So you reinvented Habitat, and now you've got Tom Dixon. What's I mean, we're running out of time, so I suppose my last question to you is, where are you
running out of battery?
What's happening today, Tom? I remember reading somewhere something you said in maybe one of your books or something, that anything new must have a superior reason for existing, which takes us back, I suppose, neatly to that whole recycling thing. What's happening at Tom Dixon, and what are you reinventing now? What's the future?
Well, you know, it's a complicated time right now. We've I want to say we've cruised along, because there's been many shocks along the way, and challenges and the rest of it. But, you know, I'm back in a position a bit that I was in Habitat. I'm owned by private equity, which means that ultimately the thing is about growth and profit, and we're 20 years old now in terms of a brand, which means that we have some products that, you know, are really successful, and people expect us to do that in the main, very metallic things, you know, again. My interest, you know, I think at the moment it's a very tough environment, you know, for obvious reasons. In the UK, you know, we've had Brexit, we've had you've all had COVID, right? You know, the hyperinflation, you know, Third World War, all of that makes a very complicated business environment. And then then, you know, the most important subject, which is, you know, the degradation of the natural world that we're all witnessing right now, means that every company has to become much more aware of its impacts on the environment. So our research is really into materials, into longevity of products, into sort of breeding out fashionability in the products themselves. And I think authentically in the furniture field, you know, the thing that you can claim is that your products are not throwaway. You know, so it's kind of nice to see that you've got still in your studio a chair that I made, you know, let's say 35 years ago. Yeah. That increasing in value. I mean, if I can do that again, then I'm doing something which at least is relatively stable. But I do think that there's much more urgent design tasks, you know, that are emerging every day, you know, from all parts of the world, which make me feel that I should be putting a lot more effort into designing things that have a really, you know, proper impact on the way that things are made or things are consumed. Yeah. So, but our research at the moment is mainly into a series of not new materials, but much more traditional materials used in new ways, like cork, yeah, like mushrooms, you know, and all the things that are going on in material science. Yeah.
Mushrooms.
Yeah, mushrooms. I mean, you know, mycelium, which is a very fashionable field at the moment, you know, for particularly in packaging, but also in things like vegan foods, and also kind of natural leather substitutes. I mean, non-meat leather substitutes.
So just the final question before you go, do you ever see yourself sort of being completely circular and reversing back to the starting point, or do you think you're just going to constantly move on and change? I mean,
no, I mean, I don't. I think
putting things together yourself.
No, I'm doing that. You know, I think COVID taught me, you know, to go back to some of the things that you talked about at the beginning, which is, you know, the freshness and the reactivity to materials that I had at the beginning, which is why I became a designer. So, you know, by being stuck in the countryside over COVID, I was able to get away from, you know, the beast that I've built here, which has 100 people that I have to keep on constantly reminding to be more radical and balancing business with design and all the rest of it, and go back just to making things for pure pleasure again. So, you know, I had a reasonably interesting COVID experience, which meant that I went back to making things with my own hands out of scrap again, and really enjoying the making process rather than trying to work out if I could commercialize things, you know. So that's been refreshing and liberating, and some of those things, you know, may influence what I do next. I mean, certainly, I do think that COVID did what it did to a lot of people, which is to make people appreciate a bit more that they're local, a bit more interested in the provenance of things, and you know, the world's going a bit back to normal now, and I think I need to maintain some of that flame of small scale, yeah, local and definitely recycled as well. Yeah.
Well, Tom, thanks. Look, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you've got to dash off, and I've got to make dinner. So,
okay. Well, I'll be in Australia in now. It looks like the trip, which was supposed to be this autumn, is now going to happen in March. So I'll see you in March. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic! I look forward to it. All right, mate. Thanks so much for joining us.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening to Reinventing Normal by Landini Associates. I'm Mark Landini, and I hope you'll tune in again next time. So until then, what normal would you reinvent?